Hey everybody, this is Dr. Hathcock, and I'm bringing you part two of the imperialism topic, picking up where we finished off the other day. So we talked about how the Maine exploded there in Havana Harbor. Next thing you know, the country wants war. You've got yellow journalism at work and all that. We talked about how in April of 1898, the Spanish were given choices. Ultimately, they chose to not free Cuba. So the United States declares war, and there you have the Spanish-American War. All right, well, before the war itself even got started, shortly after the Maine exploded, Theodore Roosevelt was working in the Navy Department. His title was Under Secretary of the Navy. He was kind of serving underneath the Maine Secretary of the Navy. But Teddy Roosevelt ordered the U.S. Pacific Fleet to sail out to Hong Kong. It might be a little hard to see on our maps that we have here, but the top right map off the coast of China is Hong Kong. The British owned it at that time. The U.S. Navy was allowed to land at Hong Kong. It was there, ready, waiting for orders. And the idea there is like as soon as war itself was declared, the U.S. Navy would sail straight for the Philippine Islands and try to make a run at that. By the way, after having sent the U.S. Pacific Fleet to Hong Kong to anchor and await further orders, shortly after that, Theodore Roosevelt resigned from the Navy Department, and he signed up to serve as a volunteer in the war to come. Roosevelt knew there was going to be a war. He knew that there really was no way that President McKinley would be able to sort of back down or talk the country down from that. So Roosevelt, as a volunteer, formed his own regiment. He actually went to, of all places, San Antonio, Texas, where he started to recruit, I don't know, rough guys, cowboys, mercenary types. Put that group together, and they'd be forever known as the Rough Riders. I have a picture of the Rough Riders here in a little bit. But yeah, Roosevelt is going to go and serve here in the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt did that because he said that as a young man, he often noticed that when men would talk about the Civil War, his father would often get very quiet, shy, sort of walk away, embarrassed, because his father did not serve during the U.S. Civil War. His father paid for somebody else to serve in his stead. And Roosevelt said that he really admired his father. He thought his father was a great man. But it seemed like the one blemish that his father had sort of in his life was that he had never served in combat. So Roosevelt swore that when it was his time to serve, when his country went to war, that he would answer that call, if you will. So Roosevelt is going to serve in combat. He's going to serve in this war. He doesn't have to. He's extremely rich. There's really no call for it, but he wants to answer that call of duty, so that he would always be able to say that he had faced combat when the time came. Okay, but now let's look at this Battle of Manila Bay. You can see there on your outline. So once war is declared there in April of 1898, the U.S. Pacific Fleet comes pouring into Manila Bay, which is there in the Philippine Islands. In fact, Manila is the capital of the Philippine Islands. But as the U.S. Navy swept into Manila Bay, they would be facing the Spanish fleet. The Spanish had a Pacific fleet anchored out there at the Philippines. They had to slip past something called Corregidor. It was a coastal defense with some big guns to fire away and try to defend Manila Bay. But by all accounts, the U.S. fleet just came in, found the Spanish completely off guard, completely unawares. And, maybe you've heard the term, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. That's basically what Manila Bay turned out to be. The Spanish didn't get most of their ships out into the battle. Most of them sat there anchored along the bay. The U.S. Navy just came in guns a-blazing. And, it took a long time. It's crazy. Accuracy was horrible back then. They couldn't hit the broadside of a barn, I swear. But they fired something like 3,000 shots that day, which is ridiculous, to eventually, sink or sink, destroy, or incapacitate roughly about 13 Spanish ships that were anchored there at Manila Bay. The U.S. fleet didn't lose a single vessel. In fact, only one American sailor died in the fighting at Manila Bay. He was an older gentleman. He was down below in what was called the powder room. It's where they start to prepare those big guns to be fired. And apparently, this guy dropped dead of a heart attack there aboard one of the boats in the U.S. Pacific Fleet. So that was the only casualty. A guy had a heart attack, and it wasn't even from combat. So Manila Bay was a resounding victory. It's a huge moment for the U.S. Navy, and it really does begin the Navy's sort of a reputation as an elite fighting force, something to be reckoned with, if you will. To have gone into Manila Bay, to have gotten past those heavy defenses at Corregidor, and to come out of the battle with like no ships lost, only one man passes away, that was an incredible feat for that time for sure, for 1898. And I don't know, the world now sees the U.S. Navy as an elite fighting force, thanks to its prowess there at the Battle of Manila Bay. When reports started to come in that there was this huge victory at Manila Bay, President McKinley didn't even know where the Philippine Islands were. Somebody had to drag out a map and point out to the president the location of the Philippine Islands, where this big victory had just happened. And, the U.S. Navy would stay there at the Philippines, anchored in Manila Bay. And this is kind of a story that involves some explaining, but it matters in the grand scheme of things. So the U.S. didn't have what you would call an occupying force. It really didn't at that moment have enough soldiers to sort of come in and take the Philippine Islands. But having the Navy there, it's a big thing. It puts America's presence there. But there was talk of maybe letting the Philippine Islands go free, letting them have their independence from Spain. But the U.S. Navy couldn't help but notice that there were British ships that would sail by and just sort of watch. The Germans were even sailing by Manila Bay and just sort of keeping an eye on things. And it became very clear that if the U.S. Navy pulled out of Manila Bay, the British, the Germans, somebody else would sail in and just capture them and take them by force. So the United States Navy is going to stay there. It's going to occupy Manila Bay. Then later, once the fighting in Cuba is over with, the United States is going to send military forces to the Philippines to go ahead and occupy and capture and take those islands. Now, Spain will give the United States the right to the Philippines. You'll see that when we get done with the war. But taking the Philippines proved to be quite a contest. Turns out the people who lived in the Philippines didn't want anyone to control them. They didn't want the United States or the Spanish or anyone else controlling their islands. And the people of the Philippines fought for their independence. It was called the Filipino insurrection. And they fought against the United States for their own nation, their own independence. Some really interesting things were happening during the Filipino War. There's a fellow by the name of General Pershing, an American general, who was in charge of our war effort there. Pershing would later lead U.S. forces in World War I as well. But here in these moments, General Pershing, he allowed for the use of torture whenever Filipino rebels were captured. The United States would torture rebels, try to get information out of them, keep them in sort of like caged off areas. They weren't opposed to cutting off a head or doing some sort of horrible torture. If you'll remember, the American media, the yellow journalists had a field day when, the Spanish would torture Cuban prisoners. They would just go on and on about how that was such an atrocity and how could you do that. But there's very little mention in American newspapers about the atrocities that the United States committed against Filipino insurrectionists. So really, I guess it's just a matter of which side you're on, right? As to whether or not you're going to report those types of stories in your newspaper. Anyway, the Filipino insurrection lasted 2 long years. But once it was over with, the United States did, quote, win the war. So the Battle of Manila Bay is the beginnings of a several-year story of the United States acquiring and taking over the Philippine Islands. Okay, now in looking at the war itself that would be fought in Cuba, uh, you know, for the United States military at that moment in time, most of the U.S. Army was out west, kind of near the reservations, dealing with Native Americans. Most U.S. combat forces were used to mountainous areas, desert areas, that type of terrain. And our guys really weren't prepared for fighting in jungles and the sort of terrain and combat that was going to be there in Cuba. Here's another truth. A lot of the U.S. Army was African American soldiers who were fighting out there or serving out there in the West on those military bases. Native Americans had given them the nickname the Buffalo Soldiers for these African American soldiers. And there are these stories of, transporting all these soldiers from the West by train, getting them down to Florida, where they would be loaded on transport vessels and taken down to Cuba. But there are stories of those trains stopping in southern cities along the way, like places in Louisiana, for example, where African American soldiers would be in a Louisiana town for the night. They go into, say, a bar or a restaurant to get a drink, to get some food. And they found that Jim Crow was very alive, that segregation would not allow them to sit in the bar. These guys were about to go serve our country in combat, go out there and face the enemy in the jungles of Cuba. And they weren't even allowed to have a beer because of the color of their skin. There were some riots that broke out as soldiers traveled across the South where, guys are going in just to get a drink, get some food, and bartender refuses to serve them. And fights would break out. Riots broke out in some cities as these African American soldiers were refused service on their way to fight the war. But eventually the U.S. Army sort of massed together in the tip of Florida. From Florida, they were put on vessels, boats, and transported south down to Cuba. And if you can look at our map on the bottom right here, you'll notice at the far right of the island of Cuba, there's a place called Guantanamo. There's a little area there known as Guantanamo Bay. And Guantanamo Bay is where the United States is going to land its military forces to prepare for the fighting there in Cuba. Once this war started in April of 1898, the U.S. Atlantic Fleet, so this is the U.S. Navy but in the Atlantic. We've already talked about the Pacific Fleet and what it did in Manila Bay. Now let's look at the U.S. Atlantic Fleet. Once war was declared, the U.S. Atlantic Fleet sailed with all haste towards the city of Santiago de Cuba. And again, looking at our map, you can see you've got Guantanamo there at the very far bottom right. And just to the left of Guantanamo is the city of Santiago de Cuba. The U.S. Navy, when it got to Santiago de Cuba, it sort of surprised the enemy. The Spanish Navy was anchored there in Santiago, but its defenses were too heavy for the U.S. Navy to try to make a run in there and have at it, if you will. So what the U.S. Navy did at Santiago was blockade the port. They wouldn't allow for any of the Spanish ships to leave, but nor could the Atlantic Fleet go in and attack. So you have this sort of a stalemate there at Santiago. As the Spanish fleet is anchored, it can't get out. If it tried to run the blockade, it would be shot down. So the U.S. Navy just blockades the coast and it's not going to let anything come out. Okay, so the United States Army, its ground forces, will land at Guantanamo Bay. And the idea is to march from Guantanamo Bay onto Santiago, try to capture the city of Santiago de Cuba. Then you could bring your heavy guns up near the coast, and then you could force the Spanish to either surrender the Atlantic Fleet they have, or they could just simply ask for a ceasefire or a truce. You could possibly win the war. So that space between Guantanamo and Santiago doesn't look like much, but it's quite a long trek. It's hot, humid jungle. A lot of American soldiers would die of disease on that route, malaria. things like that they would get. We really just sent those guys into a combat zone that they weren't prepared for. They weren't equipped and trained for. And it's really tragic just how many guys died there in those jungles of Cuba without being shot at, you know. Like when the war is over with, there's something like 4,500 Americans who die. This was a 6-week long war, and that's a lot of casualties for 6 weeks worth of fighting. Excuse me. And it's extra tragic when you realize that only 500 of those casualties were from actual combat, from like getting shot, hit by shrapnel, something like that. Like 4,000 of our soldiers died of disease, the various ailments that they would have got while being in the jungles down there in Cuba. Like 4,000 guys died of disease in this war. But this fighting on the way to Santiago de Cuba came down to these hills, these elevated positions right outside of the city of Santiago. There was 2 hills in particular that the U.S. Army had to capture. One was a place called Kettle Hill, and the other was a place called San Juan Hill. Now, the fighting at San Juan Hill is what would prove to be decisive in this war. And the true story of San Juan Hill is that those Buffalo soldiers that I mentioned earlier, those African-American soldiers, they really were the ones who did the heaviest of fighting that day. They were the ones who were pushing back the Spanish. They were the ones who had the Spanish so whipped that they were ready to retreat. And, you know, it's like the African-American soldiers did a lot of the fighting, bleeding, dying that day. And just as the Spanish defenses were collapsing and getting ready to fall, in comes rushing Theodore Roosevelt and his Rough Riders. They come charging up San Juan Hill. I swear if you read the newspaper accounts of what happened with that, William Randolph Hearst's newspaper accounts in particular of what happened at San Juan Hill, you'd swear that Teddy Roosevelt was this Rambo figure that just went charging up by himself, you know, taking out all these soldiers as he went. But truth be told, that charge up San Juan Hill was very disorganized. There were moments where, like, Roosevelt would tell the guys, "Hey, follow me, boys," and they would run from one position to find cover on another. And as they were just sort of running, you know, Roosevelt, the guys around him would get shot, and he would sort of reach this defensive position and realize he was all by himself because the guys he had leading with him, the guys he was leading, were all shot. So then he would just sort of come running back to where the rest of the group was, being shot at the whole time. Miraculously somehow survived that day. Roosevelt later said it was the greatest day of his life. Just the, you know, the adrenaline and everything that was going. People who were there that day said that there were like 5 different occasions where he probably should have died. But somehow, some way, I guess through the grace of God, the man survived the day. But the Rough Riders do go charging up San Juan Hill. I don't want to belittle that. It was courageous. Rough Riders did die in that fight. But, you know, the newspapers could have also mentioned the fact that it was African-American soldiers who really broke down the enemy's defenses, that African-American soldiers did play a role in what happened at San Juan Hill. It didn't just have to be all hero worship of Teddy Roosevelt for what happened that day. But once San Juan Hill was captured, the United States had an elevated position outside the city where they could place their heavy guns. They brought their big heavy guns up to the top of San Juan Hill and were preparing to fire onto the Spanish fleet anchored down in Santiago. But the Spanish realized that it was fruitless to continue this. Also, they didn't want to lose their very valuable, very precious Atlantic Spanish fleet. So after the capture of San Juan Hill, the Spanish will, in a sense, raise the white flag, surrender. And that's how the war comes to an end. The fighting in Cuba comes to an end, is with victory at San Juan Hill and the realization that the Spanish fleet would be decimated unless the Spanish surrendered. Okay, so our Secretary of State at the time, a fellow named Hayes, called the Spanish-American War a nice, neat little war. It lasted 6 weeks. It's a huge victory for the United States. And, you know, 500 did die in fighting. But again, another 4,000 died because of disease. That's just, it's almost unforgivable. what happened, to send those men into that combat zone completely woefully unprepared for what they were going to face there in the jungles. Okay, but looking at the results of the war, so a big meeting will happen in Paris. We'll get a Treaty of Paris, 1898. And in the Treaty of Paris, 1898, a lot of things happen. I guess number one point to the Treaty of Paris, 1898, is that Cuba is a free and independent country. Cuba's going to get her independence at the end of all this. It was the whole point of the war. It was the whole point of American intervention. So Cuba will get her independence is point number one. With a little star right to the side of that, I guess it's a little side note. Yes, Cuba's free and independent, but Cuba has a big brother named the United States, who's going to be very involved in her politics, her economics, always sort of breathing down her neck and looking down her shoulder. So yeah, Cuba's free and independent, but the United States is going to take a heavy hand in Cuban affairs and in things to come. Let's see, point number two, the United States is going to get some land out of this. The United States will acquire Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippine Islands, thanks to the Treaty of Paris, 1898. And like I explained, it took 2 years of fighting in the Philippines for the Filipinos to accept American rule. But the Treaty of Paris, 1898, did give the United States Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippine Islands. Let's see, another result of this. It's not necessarily in the Treaty of Paris, 1898, but more results. The United States Navy is seen as an effective fighting force. It's seen as an elite unit, something to be reckoned with on the world stage. Point number four, the United States is now considered a superpower. Its military is now considered something to be concerned with, something to rival the powers of the world. I don't want to make too much of this, but it really is an important moment. It's like for the first time in human history, you have a power in the Western Hemisphere that's considered to be a dominant world power. It's like up to this point, it's been, Africa or the Greeks or the Romans or something from Europe that's the dominant world power. So this is the first time you have sort of a Western Hemisphere power emerge to rival the other powers of the world. Another result of this war, the United States military is going to start to modernize after this war. You know, the fact that 4,000 guys died from disease was just, it was criminal. The U.S. government understood that, the military understood that, and they strived to do better in things to come. So that going forward, you'd have a more professional fighting force. They would train the military to fight in any type of conditions that might arise. Snow, desert, mountain, jungle. So, it's more of a professional army that's trained in different scenarios, different possible combat zones. They're going to try to do a better job of, keeping guys from dying of disease in combat as well. But truth be told, in World War I, a lot of guys will die from disease there too. It's just disease is just a part of combat. It's a part of what happens. But they would strive to do better after suffering 4,000 casualties due to disease in those jungles of Cuba. Okay, but acquiring the Philippine Islands, kind of sticking to our outline here, getting the Philippine Islands was really one of the bigger things that the United States got out of this war. The Philippine Islands became essentially like America's stepping block to trade with China, Japan, Korea, all of Asia. It sort of became a crown jewel, if you will, of the U.S. empire. Having the Philippine Islands was the gateway to opening up China to U.S. trade. All right, so this night's quote, nice, neat little war comes to an end. It's a huge victory for the United States. Here is Theodore Roosevelt in a picture with his Rough Rider unit. And I guess that's another result of the war that I didn't mention, but I'll get it here. Theodore Roosevelt does become a national hero after this war. He's someone who's, like, if you lived in New York at that time, you knew who Theodore Roosevelt was. Probably if you lived in the Northeast, you knew who Roosevelt was. But after this war, he's known way down in the southern parts of Texas. He's known way out on the west coast of California. He really does become a national figure because of that charge up San Juan Hill and what he and his Rough Riders did. I've always sort of given this analogy. If you've studied the first half American history, you might remember the Battle of New Orleans made Andrew Jackson this national hero. It's very similar here. The Battle at San Juan Hill is going to make Theodore Roosevelt sort of a national figure. It essentially is going to lead to bigger roles in his life, like, I don't know, being president of the United States. Okay, now looking at Congress and the post-war settlement. So there is a Treaty of Paris that's been negotiated. But the thing about the way our democratic process works is the executive branch, through the State Department, can negotiate treaties. It can negotiate peace settlements. But it's our legislative branch, our Congress, that ultimately accepts those treaties, votes on it, and decides whether or not we're going to abide by it. So when the Treaty of Paris 1898 goes before the United States Congress, surprise, surprise, a big fight breaks out between Democrats and Republicans over whether or not to accept the post-war settlement. Now, it was Republicans who wanted to go ahead and ratify the Treaty of Paris, 1898. They said, look, these are great things. We get all this land. Cuba will be free and independent. So Republicans in the Congress said, yes, we should go ahead and ratify the treaty, accept its terms. But it was the Democrats who raised some objections. In fact, it was our friend William Jennings Bryan, Mr. Populism himself, who led this Democratic opposition to the ratification of that treaty. William Jennings Bryan, he didn't have a problem with a free and independent Cuba. But what he did have a problem with was the United States holding on to Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippine Islands. One part of Bryan's argument was, this isn't the United States that we grew up in. We shouldn't be taking these islands. We shouldn't be holding these people against their will. We're kind of acting like the redcoats now, and we're colonizing and taking people over. So Bryan didn't like that aspect of things, that the United States was becoming a colonial superpower. But he also said, that with this land comes responsibility. We're going to have to defend these areas, these islands, if they're ever attacked. He was very afraid that it could, in the future, drag the United States into a conflict. And, he called it. He's exactly right. Later on down the line, the Japanese will want places like the Philippine Islands. So that, in a sense, will drag the United States into World War II. But there were other things that were happening along the way as well. There was an organization that was forming in America at the time called the Anti-Imperialism League, or the Anti-Imperialism Association. This group of people, which was, it had some pretty big guys behind it. It was headed up by Andrew Carnegie. Mark Twain, the American author, was a part of this thing. William Jennings Bryan is a big supporter of it. And anti-imperialists basically argued that, number one, the United States shouldn't be colonizing. It shouldn't be controlling other people. But number two, and this is kind of a sad part of it as well, these anti-imperialists argued that, taking these areas means that these people now get to be Americans. And this is racism. It's ugly. It's, what they're saying. They don't want Puerto Ricans becoming American citizens, and they don't want Filipinos becoming American citizens. Because technically, if you take these lands and they are American property, then people from Puerto Rico can travel to the United States freely. They can move to New York City and find work and live there in the city. So they felt that it was just sort of going to bring the country down by bringing these other ethnic groups into the United States. Carnegie, for his part, he argued that it would hurt labor, that Puerto Ricans and Filipinos would travel to the United States, would seek industrial jobs, and that would hurt the American workforce that was already having such a problem finding work. That's a nice way to couch your racism, honestly, into the equation, because really they just didn't want people of different ethnic groups being able to so freely travel across the United States. So there's a lot wrapped up in that anti-imperialist argument, that the United States shouldn't be conquering other lands, it shouldn't be controlling other people. But then also there's that ugly stuff, the racist part of what they were arguing. Truth be told, though, at the end of the day, the Republicans had the numbers. The country was going through this euphoric sense of patriotic pride. They had the votes. It passed. It ratified anyways. But I do think it's interesting to note that opposition to the settlement and that idea that, if we take these lands, it could lead to a future conflict between the United States and another country. Okay, now looking at the open door policy with China. I explained to you guys that a lot of this stuff is about opening up the U.S. economy to new markets. That China is, was, probably always will be, the biggest market on Earth. So yeah, the United States wanted to sell its products in the biggest market on Earth, over there in China. The problem with China, though, in the late 1890s, is you have a lot of government instability. The European powers are already there. The British are already in China. So are the French and the Germans. They're trying to sell their products in China, trying to make some money off of China as well. And there were moments where wars almost broke out in China over trade. Like the British and the Germans almost went to war over who controlled what markets and who could sell where. Truth be told, wars had broken out over European domination of China. You could read about the Opium Wars, for example, where the British were literally selling opium to people in China. The Chinese government wanted to stop that, and the British said, no, you can't stop that. But so anyways, here comes the United States. We're in the process of controlling the Philippine Islands, and we want to sell our American products in China. But we don't want to trigger like a world war. We don't want to start a shooting fight with the Germans or something over trade in China. So U.S. Secretary of State Hayes, same guy who said that the Spanish-American War was a nice, neat little war, that guy is going to formulate something called the open door policy with China. Essentially, it works like this. He says that China should essentially be a door that any of us can open. So any nation can walk into China. Any nation can open that door and walk into trade with China. There's no need for conflict, for war. There's no need to control certain areas. Just, hey, we'll all show up. We'll all try to sell our products, and whoever makes the most money, good for them. So the open door policy with China is this idea of trade with China that anyone can partake in, and there's no reason for control, for combat, for shooting at each other over this trade. The European powers sort of giggled at this. They didn't take it too seriously at first. But, eventually China was more or less treated as an open door. The United States certainly did trade a lot of products with China and never really got into any sort of shooting matches with the European powers. I would also say this, the people of China, I don't know that I would say completely loved the United States. I wouldn't go that far. But the Chinese people had a decent level of respect for the United States for at least it being about trade and not about control and, owning certain areas. China and the United States had a really decent relationship that would go on through World War II even. In fact, China was fighting Japan years before the United States got involved in World War II. And the United States would try to help the Chinese in that fight against the Japanese even before Pearl Harbor took place. So yeah, this open door policy led to a good relationship between the two countries. But then after World War II, China will find itself in the midst of a civil war. In 1949, the communists will take over in China. And that door shut. There's been a tense relationship between our two countries ever since. But the open door policy was something that worked well. It was beneficial, definitely for the United States. as our country made a lot of money off of trade with China. But then, communism took over in 1949. Okay, looking at this last point of a Panama Canal, I'm going to use maps and pictures for the rest of this story about the Panama Canal. But if you just sort of look at how the Earth itself is set up, you look at North America on your left-hand side, with Mexico, the United States, Canada. Then you look at how South America is set up. There's just a little bit of strip of land that connects the two continents there. And there had been forever a dream of building a canal to allow for ships to sail through that little strip of land that separates North America from South America. The French were the first ones to try this concept of building a canal through there. Yeah, I guess you'll just have to take my word for it. Engineers went out to that part of the world, surveyed the land, tried to make some calculations, and decided that a strip of an area known as Panama, which is actually controlled by Colombia at that time, they believed that Panama was the best location for digging out a canal to allow for naval vessels to pass through North and South America. So what would come to be known as the Panama Canal was actually first started by the French, as they sent teams of people out there to dig. They had to get permission from the Colombian government to dig through there in that area known as Panama. But the French very quickly ran into some problems out there in Panama. Problem number one was the jungle. Again, you've got diseases that are born out of the jungle, and the French started losing a lot of workers thanks to diseases, malaria and things like that that their people would catch while they were digging out there in Panama. Second problem that the French ran into real quick was money. These things are expensive. They take time. They take money. And this French company was just hemorrhaging money along the way. So after losing too many people and too much money, the French just sort of gave up on the project. They back out. They walk away. So in comes the United States in the early 1900s, looking to pick this project up, to finish it out. But in order to do that, we also had to get permission from the nation of Colombia to dig through that area to dig the canal. There was this back and forth with the Colombian government where, at one point we thought we had a deal, an agreement, that the money was right. But the Panamanians backed out on that agreement. They wanted more money. So then the Americans ponied up a little bit more money, and it seemed like everything was set and right. But again, Colombia said, no, that's not enough money, and they stalled. So it was pretty obvious that Colombia was just trying to get as much money as it could out of the deal, that they just kept holding this thing up and basically stretching it out as far as they could to get as much money as they can. So the United States decided to take matters into its own hands. Theodore Roosevelt's president of the United States in these moments. And the United States decided to back a revolution, to back a throwover. Basically, we were going to back Panamanian rebels who would rise up and fight for their independence from the nation of Colombia. These Panamanian rebels were given American weapons, supplies, food, you name it, we gave it to them. We sent some of our gunboats down that way to help these Colombians out. So with American backing, the people of Panama rise up. They win their independence from Colombia. Immediately, the United States will recognize Panama, sign agreements with Panama. Panama's going to have a big brother in the United States to protect it. And it was all very understood that once independence was gained for Panama, that the United States would be given the right to basically dig a massive trench right through the middle of the country of Panama. So Panama becomes its own independent country. The United States gets the rights to dig the Panama Canal Zone. And very quickly, we send engineers that way. Workers out there are starting to work. And we start to run into some of the same problems. It's expensive. It's going to take time. But our Congress was committed to seeing this thing through to its end. But another problem American workers were facing were the various diseases born out of the jungle. But we invented things like various bug sprays to help from getting bit by mosquitoes and things like that. We took health and safety a little more seriously at that point in time. And you can see as time goes, the construction of the project. Here you have it in 1907 where they're digging out one of the locks, one of the levees. Here in 1908, you can see the lock is getting a little bit deeper. It's getting to the point where you can start to bring ships through. Then you start to put in the ports, the levees themselves, the locks, the levees. And here you can see the Panama Canal eventually is going to be completed. It's not just this one little area right here. It's like actually a series of these locks as these big oceanic vessels go through. So once the Panama Canal Zone is complete, it really is a huge benefit, not just to the United States, but to the world. And when you think about what the Panama Canal Zone means, number one, it means faster travel. If you're going from one part of the world to the other, you don't have to go around the tip of South America anymore. You can just cut right through the Panama Canal Zone. So it does mean faster travel. Side note to that, it also means a better ability for the United States to defend the country. God forbid something should happen on the West Coast, an attack of some kind. It'd be nice to get the U.S. Navy from the Atlantic side over to the Pacific side quickly to possibly help with the fighting over there. So we don't have to travel around South America anymore. We can just cut right through the middle there at that Panama Canal. So it helps national defense as well, national security. It also fostered more world trade, though. European countries began to trade more in South America and in Latin America because they had this quicker route that they could use going through the Panama Canal Zone. All right, so completion of the Panama Canal, it is a part of American imperialism. It is a part of this growing empire that the United States has. And I guess to summarize this topic, for better or worse, and you can have your own opinions on this, but for better or worse, the United States becomes a global superpower here in the 1890s. With that, the United States seems to be everywhere all at once. Now when problems happen in the world, the United States is looked to as a leader, as someone who can step up and possibly solve a crisis, a scenario, a problem. And in the 20th century, the United States is going to find itself involved in several major conflicts, having to sort of shoulder the load for democracy in the free world. And a lot of that started here in the 1890s with this rise of imperialism in the United States. All right, thanks, and have a nice day. Bye.